So welcome everyone. This is going to be the last society of this calendar year of 2020. So I'm glad you could join us, and I'll actually be your speaker today. So we've had all guest speakers, really great guest speakers, but I'm going to be closing out the year here. So it's a topic that I really love, that I'm personally very interested in, and so I'm going to share my screen now, and we can begin. All right, there we go. Okay, so does the New Testament misquote the Old Testament in trying to prove Jesus? So I think most of us know that the New Testament frequently quotes from the Old in order to affirm Jesus as the Messiah, as the promised one of the Old Testament. And so this is a very important topic because a lot of Christianity rests on the way that the New Testament handles the Old Testament. And this issue matters for many, many reasons. So as I said, the New Testament authors make this case that Jesus is the Messiah, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. And if these citations are not accurate or violate the Old Testament author's intent, then at a minimum, this impugns the integrity of the apostles. And frankly, I think this is an issue that touches on a lot of facets of apologetics. If you engage with speaking with agnostics, atheists, Muslims, people who don't have as much familiarity with these issues of how to handle the two testaments, it becomes very important, and we all need to have great answers on this. And so I'm going to tell you here how I like to answer these questions, and hopefully you'll find them satisfying. All right, so we're going to look today mostly at one case study, and most people would say it's the most difficult of all of the passages that the New Testament cites from the Old. Here, we're going to look at a second one as well, but we're going to focus our time primarily on this one here. So we're going to read the original passage here. This one, I'm quoting from either the ESV or the New King James. This one I believe is the ESV. So this says here in Hosea 11, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms. But they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love. And I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down to them and fed them." Okay, so especially draw your attention here to verse 1. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And I think we can see here that the overall thrust of this passage is that they were called out, but then they kept on sacrificing to Baals and to idols. But in the midst of all this, God was working unbeknownst to them to, I love this line here in verse 4, to lead them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love. Okay, so now this is the passage in the Old Testament. And then now let's read where it's quoted from, which is in Matthew chapter 2. Okay, so here in Matthew 2, Matthew writes, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child and to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.' Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, 'Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead.' And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel." Okay, so I want us to identify here some of the problems. There's three main problems, I'll just tell you right now, that people have leveled at Matthew and said, all right, Matthew is just not a responsible writer here for three reasons of how he quotes from this line here, out of Egypt I called my son, in Hosea 11:1, and you can see it's embedded right here in verse 15, out of Egypt I called my son. So feel free to call them out here. What do you think the three main problems are that people have with Matthew's use of this text in Hosea?
I would say maybe one is that the original text from Hosea seems to be more narrative than prophetic, or that it's just explaining something that happened rather than prophesying a future event.
Exactly. So that's the big one right there. And so thanks, Sarah, for that. That's exactly right. That you get no hint when you read this passage in Hosea 11. It seems very much past tense. You're just narrating the history of Israel here. Out of Egypt I call my son, and then even this description of idolatry and God leading them. But here in verse 15, what Matthew says is this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. And so people are like, what in the world? This is like totally not some prophecy here. It's just historic narrative. So that's the big one. There's two more.
Another one might be in Hosea. It looks like the son reference is about Israel, and then here Matthew's applying it singularly to like a person, Jesus.
Yeah, very good, Kojo. That's the number two. So we're getting them in order. That's the second biggest objection that people have, is that it's pretty clear here when you read in Hosea 11, it's a reference to corporate Israel, right? It's talking about the history of the nation of Israel. And here in verse 15, he's obviously speaking about just Jesus here. And so it seems like that's not as well in keeping with the intent. The third one is the hardest and the most obscure. I'll see if anybody wants to take a stab at that, but we got the big two already. Does anyone want to see what one the third one is? We're not going to spend that much time on this anyway, but there's a third problem that people have with this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a big number three, Finny, but one thought is just that if you look at the passage, you might be able to make a stretch and say, okay, well, part of it applies, but not all of it applies, or not. You basically have to be very selective in the portion that you would say applies. For example, nobody would say that Jesus, was involved in idolatry, etc. So you really have to be very selective about the part of the passage that you would apply, if you were to do it at all. But again, I'm not sure if that's the big number three. So
that's good. I would put that, Imran, as a subset of the second one, where the corporate Israel reference, idolatry, like we just read in the Hosea 11 passage, it doesn't apply to Jesus. So that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because that's very, very much a correlate of that second problem that people have. The third one, I'll just say it here, is that people don't like where it's placed in the text. So you can see it's used for when Mary and Joseph and Jesus go into Egypt here. And then all this happens with Herod and the killing of the babies, but they don't actually leave Egypt until verse 21. And so people say, well, why is it here at the beginning? It should be here at the end, closer to verse 21. So that's admittedly the smallest issue of the three about where it's positioned, but just for completeness, I listed that out. So those are the three problems. Hosea seems to be historically reflective, not prophetic. Hosea's corporate, Matthew's individual. And then also what Imran said there. And then third, Matthew cites Hosea when they're going into Egypt, not when they're coming out. Okay, so those are the big three. And I will say that people just skewer Matthew over this. And there are many, many books and articles that speak about this and how problematic this is. And so this slide and the next slide are from an author named G.K. Beale, who's collated some of this. And he's noted that Protestant commentators, and who are, you would think, are sort of fairly Bible-believing individuals, have just howled at Matthew's use here. So here's just some quotes to show you how different authors have cited this. So an author named Peter Enns says, this is a parade example of the manner in which the New Testament uses the Old Testament, especially in not being interested in reproducing the meaning of the Old Testament text, but reading into them the Old Testament foreign Christological presuppositions. Okay, so little harsh there. Another author, Martin Pickup, says, this is the most troubling case of New Testament exegesis of the Old Testament for many people. And then finally, another author here, Eugene Boring, says Matthew's use of scripture in Matthew 1 and 2, including the Hosea 11 quotation, is in contrast with their obvious original meaning. And the changes he makes in the text itself make him subject to the charge of manipulating the evidence in a way that will be unconvincing to outsiders. Okay, so as I said, this is largely regarded as the most difficult case here of being inaccurate and misquoting the Old Testament in support of Jesus here. So we're gonna, like I said, try to tackle this as our prime example. We'll do a little bit of time on a smaller one. If you can get this one and the smaller example, everything else is much, much easier there. It's my goal is everybody walks away with confidence on how to understand this. Okay, so again, as I said, this slide is as well. I'm going to give Beal credit for this. He spent a lot of time on this subject and done some really good work on this. I'm going to distill down some of this in a little more simplified way in the interest of time, but there are some common ways that people have described this kind of supposedly irresponsible, sort of wild New Testament way, supposedly wild way of quoting the Old Testament. And the first example that you'll see, and you read this in a lot of books, that they'll say, oh, well, this is how the Jews were used to quoting scripture at the time. And so they believe that there's this sort of Jewish hermeneutic that's at play, which explains why Matthew is not in keeping with how we would be reading the Old Testament there. And again, I'm going to be a little bit abbreviated here, but just to say a tiny bit about this, almost always when people say, oh, the Jewish method or the Jewish hermeneutic, they tend to be looking at the Talmud or maybe the Mishnah. Does anybody know roughly when those were written? Just ballpark? The Talmud and the Mishnah? So they're roughly like 4th century AD, 6th century AD, somewhere in that range there. And you see this a lot. It personally drives me crazy. So many people will read something from the Talmud or the Mishnah, and they'll assume that that's what 1st century Judaism was like. Virtually all of the examples that people use are post AD 70. AD 70 was, of course, when the temple was destroyed. And after AD 70, we have the rise of so-called rabbinic Judaism, where Judaism takes on a new trend, a new way of thinking as they don't have a temple anymore. And Judaism really changes in its character. And everybody agrees on this. Even Jews would agree that as the temple is destroyed, there has to be a lot of reflection and rethinking of what it means to be a faithful Jew in this new environment there. And so we can't assume that the Jewish exegesis pre-AD 70 was the same thing as it was in 4th, 5th, 6th century. I mean, I would be the first to say that Christianity changed a lot during that time, going from 1st century to 4th, 5th, and 6th century. And so if Christianity is changing, why doesn't Judaism change? There's a lot of changes that are happening in both religions at the time. And I just think it's just bad hermeneutics. It's unfair, poor scholarship to assume that. Another way that people describe the New Testament approach is they'll say it's this hyper-Christocentric approach. And they'll say that basically Christians were caught up in apologetics against Judaism and they went overboard. Basically, this school of thought says that as Christians are trying to prove Jesus from the Old Testament, they're going back and forth with various Jewish debate opponents, and in all of that, they're going too far. And there's an author, Barnabas Lindars, who has made this argument way back in the 60s. The final approach that people have taken for this is very interesting. It's sometimes called the postmodern reader response way of going about it, which basically says that you can't really know what author intent was. And so you're allowed to, quote, reappropriate the tradition, which is kind of fancy language to basically mean you can change the meaning. And the postmodern schools of thought have endless writings on this notion of the infinity of meanings, the open-endedness of text. And because in general, they don't put as much stock in author intent, it's left to the reader to discern what the meaning is. There's a great quote that Beale gives from the school of thought where someone says, there's a continuous fertility of the metaphoric terrain. I love that. It just sounds like such a typical thing that an academic would say. The continuous fertility of the metaphoric terrain basically means you can kind of make text what you want them to say. And so in this way of reading the New Testament, the Old Testament is used basically as a grab bag of texts, and you can kind of grab them and do with them as you like and reappropriate them for your own personal agenda there. So it's very interesting just to point out that these authors who promote this more postmodern reader response theory believe that you can't really get at author intent, but interestingly, they believe that you can understand their intent. So there is some hypocrisy in that, where these postmodern reader response theories believe that there's this impenetrable wall that you can't get behind with an author, except for their own books, their own writings, where you can't understand what they're saying. So a little bit of hypocrisy in that. Okay, so is there a fourth way? So as I said, these are how people try to handle the supposedly irresponsible and wild ways that, say, Matthew would use Hosea in. And I'm going to say that there is a fourth way that is way more satisfying and frankly way more faithful historically to what we understand. And to understand this, we have to go back and look at Jesus himself. So in Luke 24, there's a very famous passage, the Road to Emmaus, where Jesus says this. He says, "And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." Okay, this is a very important passage because, you know, we all would have loved to have been here, heard the speech that Jesus gave, where he goes to the disciples and he tells them in all the scriptures where he was present there. And even though we unfortunately don't have the actual speech that Jesus gave in Luke 24, I think it's a reasonable assumption to say that what we have in the New Testament is exactly that. We have the apostles telling us the methodology that Jesus gave to them when he gave this speech here on the road to Emmaus. And so it's very likely that we're not looking at how Matthew would have understood this, but we're looking at, or I should say merely Matthew, we're looking at how Jesus understood the Old Testament. And so that's kind of an interesting thought, that in fact, maybe we're not thinking enough about the fountainhead of how to read the Old Testament in this way, that perhaps it is Jesus. So might we be in this passage, even in Matthew 2, be reading about how Jesus read the Old Testament? Okay, so we need to explain a little bit more here about some terms that are commonly confused. So I wish we could do a lot more time just on this concept here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go quickly through this. So there's this concept of a type. And so the word type is used in the New Testament. It's used here, for example, in Romans 5:14. It says, "Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned, according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type, typos, of him who was to come." So that word is literally used here by Paul here. And so he's saying Adam is a type, a typos of him who is to come, obviously Jesus. And in fact, if you look at secular literature at the time, you have this notion of like a signet ring. So here's a signet ring. And that signet ring, you can see this kind of like a diamond here. It's leaving its impression in this wax. This is how secular people were using the term of a type or a typos, where they were describing this very close relationship, this relationship of correspondence between the wax image and the ring that would generate that image. And then you also have a word that the New Testament uses, the word antitype, which is also used in the New Testament. So here it's used in 1 Peter chapter 3. There is also an antitype, antitupos, which now saves us, baptism. That's the New King James. The ESV does it a little more in a more idiomatic way. It says baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you. Okay, so it's translating this word antitype as corresponds. So you have the type and the antitype. So you have the ring and the wax, right? So they're very, very close there in arrangement. Okay, so that's just the first order description of what a type is. But in general, and there's whole books that have been written about this motif of a type is very, very prominent in how Jews and Christians understood history to function. Okay, so we're going to focus obviously here on Christianity, but the type-antitype pairing is often found across the Testaments. So actually, you know what? I have one slide out of order. Let me just pull this. Okay, so I'll just read it in the interest of time. So there's different categories of types here that are extremely useful and good for us to know about. I like to keep these straight in my mind. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna share my screen to do it twice. The categories of types here, which I want us to know about and to think about here, even though we're going to only explore a fraction of this, is you can have people who are types. So I just showed you how Paul believed that Adam was a type of Jesus, but Abraham is treated as such. Isaac, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, David, Jonah, Daniel. I mean, there's a long list of people who function as types. You can have events that function as types. So the flood is used as a type of the end final judgment. The plagues of Egypt, the bronze serpent is treated as a type of the cross. Cities of refuge. The festivals, Year of Jubilee, Day of Atonement, Passover, rich typology in these festivals. And then finally, structures. So the Ark, the Tabernacle, and the Temple. And I'm really happy that most of you got to hear a great lecture a couple weeks ago on the typology of the tabernacle from Chuck Pike. Okay, so these are very common. These are very rich structures that exist there. Let's switch screens again. And so now that we have that in our mind, what I want us to do is to think now about this notion of typology as relates to the book of Hosea. Okay, so share my screen. Okay, so so background of Hosea. Who can tell us just a tiny bit of the background of Hosea? Like, who can give us just a little bit of characterization on this book from the Old Testament? Any takers? This is one of the things which I teach a class at a Christian college in downtown Boston, but I always tell everybody with every single book of the Bible, every major character, you should be able to say 2 minutes about roughly when they lived and what their message was, and just a little bit about the book. If nobody wants to do it, I will take a stab at this. So Hosea, there's this whole chart which I like to do. Maybe sometime we can go through it. But Hosea was a minor prophet who lived and who primarily ministered, although not exclusively, to the northern kingdom of Israel. And this was at a time when Assyria, the kingdom of Assyria, was growing in power, and it was threatening to conquer and dominate both Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And Hosea used this very powerful image of marrying an unfaithful woman named Gomer as a way to illustrate how God had wed himself to an unfaithful wife. And even though Gomer was unfaithful, just like Israel had been unfaithful, God was going to find a way to restore the relationship. And so interestingly, and this is one of the many reasons why it's good to study original languages here. I don't know how many of you have studied Hebrew, but here's the word for Hosea in Hebrew. So in Hebrew, the name Hosea is almost identical to the name for Yeshua or Jesus. So some of you know the story of Joshua, the person who was kind of Moses' right-hand man who ultimately led the people into the promised land. His name was actually originally Hosea or Hosea, depending on your translation. but it was changed to Yeshua, which is the only difference is that Hosea means he saves, Yeshua means Yah saves or Yahweh saves, but it's basically the same name and it has the same meaning there. So there's a couple of books in the Old Testament that are very intriguing, particularly if you're reading them in the original languages. So if you're reading the book of Joshua in the first century, when everyone's reading that, they were reading the Septuagint. It would have been the book of Jesus, because Joshua and Jesus are the same thing. And so you can imagine if you're a first century Christian thinking, whoa, here's the sixth book of the Old Testament. It's called the book of Jesus. And there's a lot of typology there because, you know, we see, for example, that Moses, as the one who embodies the law, he can't take them into the promised land, that you need Joshua to take you into the promised land. And so the law has this function. It can take you right up to the Jordan, but it can't take you into the promised land. You need Joshua to do that. And so a lot of rich typology came from that. But so there's the book of Joshua, and then there's the book of Hosea. So again, Hosea is a very close name to Jesus' name. As I mentioned, he prophesies during the 8th century BC to the northern kingdom of Israel. Assyria is threatening to destroy Israel. And not long after Hosea's prophecy, in fact, Assyria comes in and just destroys Israel and conquers and exiles it. One of the major themes of Hosea is this salvation through judgment. That is, God is going to restore back the people after this time of exile. Okay, so this is in a nutshell what Hosea is doing here, and it's fascinating. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at numerous references when we look at the book as a whole to where Hosea describes the Assyrian exile as being like the Egyptian captivity, the Assyrian exile that's going to happen. Remember, he's prophesying before it happens. So here in Hosea 7:16, he says, "They return, but not to the Most High. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword for the cursings of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt." So future tense there, he's talking about Israel, and he's saying they're going to be derided. They're going to be mocked in the land of Egypt. So he's speaking here about Egypt as future. Hosea 8:13, "For the sacrifices of my offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt." Fascinating again. So speaking here about the northern kingdom here, and God is saying, or Hosea is speaking on behalf of God, saying, "We're offering sacrifices here. God's not accepting them. He's going to remember their sin and punish them. They shall go back to Egypt." All right, Hosea 9:3. This is not just once or twice. Hosea 9:3. "They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim," which is the prominent tribe in the north, "shall return to Egypt and shall eat unclean things in Assyria." So here you can see very clearly, you see this parallel structure here between Egypt and Assyria. He's treating both of them as almost the same. So he's envisioning when the people go into captivity, it's like they're going back to bondage under Egypt. Another one, Hosea 9:6, "For indeed they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis," which is a city in Egypt, "shall bury them. Nettles are sharp thorns, shall possess their valuables of silver. Thorns shall be in their tents." So he's saying they're going to go off to Egypt. And again, he's picturing the Assyrian exile being like Egyptian captivity. Fascinating. Okay, so I showed you 4 references there, peppered throughout Hosea, where he's describing this future exile here as being like going under Egypt. Okay, interestingly, Hosea also prophesies another exodus. Very, very interesting. He says this, "Then God said, call his name Lo Ami." Lo in Hebrew means no or not. Am is the word for people. And then E is the ending you put on for my. So Lo Ami is not my people. So then it says it here in the next line, "For you are not my people, and I will not be your God. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered, and it shall come to pass. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. Then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together and appoint for themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel." Jezreel was a prominent city in the north. It's where a lot of, for a while, actually Ahab had the capital city of Israel being Jezreel. So when it says great will be the day of Jezreel, the capital there, one of the capitals along with Samaria, is mentioned there. So, okay, so what's he saying here? He's saying, you're not my people, and I'm not your God, but there's going to come this day where you're going to be called sons of the living God. Everyone's going to be gathered back together. There's going to be one head, and they will come up out of the land. Okay, so come up out of the land sounds sort of like an Exodus, come up out of Assyria, perhaps. And here in Hosea 2, it makes it a little more explicit. Again, I find this just incredible. So in Hosea 2, verse 13, I will punish her, Israel, for the days of the Baals to which she burned incense. She decked herself with her earrings and jewelry and went after her lovers. But me she forgot, says the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, will bring her into the wilderness and speak comfort to her. I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of hope. She shall sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. Okay, so hearkening back to this Egyptian Exodus. Okay, and then to make it even more incredible, right in the very same chapter, Hosea 11, that is the chapter in question here, it says this, they shall walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, then his sons shall come trembling from the west. And look at this. They shall come trembling like a bird from Egypt, like a dove from the land of Assyria, and I will let them dwell in their houses. So again, very clear here. You can see this parallel language that's used here where coming out of Assyria is like coming out of Egypt. And so there's this prophecy here of this second Exodus that is being described in the very chapter that Matthew is quoting from, Hosea chapter 11. Okay, so really interesting that when you read the book as a whole, you don't find one or two, but throughout is this description of this new Exodus here. Okay, just to give a little bit more, this new Exodus is associated with David, their king. All right, so Hosea 3:5 says, afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Okay, so again, it's prophesied here. Does anybody know, was King David before this when Hosea wrote, or was he when was David roughly time-wise? After Hosea or before Hosea?
Before?
Yeah, definitely before, right? So David lived ballpark, it's a good number to remember, ballpark around 1000 BC. He was the second king of Israel, right? Saul, David, Solomon, and then the kingdom splits into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And so here it's very interesting because he says that the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. David's long dead and gone. So here he's speaking now of another David who is going to be this king that the Israelites seek. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that this Exodus imagery and this Egypt imagery is all throughout Hosea. How is the Exodus motif used in the New Testament? Some of you have probably heard this, but not sure where this comes from or where it's being used here. I love this topic. So if you look in Luke chapter 9, I'm going to show here the ESV. So it says, this is the famous story of the Mount of Transfiguration. It says, now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with them Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered. Sorry, there's footnotes there that I didn't remove. That's the F and the G. Altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And the ESV puts a little footnote on that word departure, and it says, the footnote is very short, it just says Greek : Exodus. So this word here in verse 31 is, if you were to translate that more literally, you would say, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. I wish the translations would put in the word exodus there. It's got to be exodus here. I mean, it even says about to accomplish at Jerusalem. For those of you who have done Greek, I know some of you on this call have done it. I just copied this verse in. So it's hoi offentes en doxe elegon tein exodon avtu hen emelen plerun en Jerusalemen. So here you can see the word Exodus used, but then interestingly, it says here this word accomplish is the word plerun. This is the ESV, how they translated the word plerun. When you think of the word plerun, what should you think of? It's a really important word that Jesus uses frequently. Remember that? The Greek word is pleroo, would be the lexical form, and it's usually translated as fulfill. So when Jesus says, I didn't come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it, it's the word pleroo here. So it's literally, he spoke of his exodus, which he was about to fulfill at Jerusalem. This is, I would say, the dominant consensus of most of the commentators today. I'll just read you one commentator here, Joel Green, who says Luke's model readers may well recognize his use of what have become stock expressions or conventional patterns borrowed from and based on the Old Testament story of the Exodus. For example, the presence of companions, the setting on a mountain, the explicit mention of Moses, Jesus's change of countenance, references to tents or tabernacles, the cloud, the motif of fear, the clear allusion to Deuteronomy 18:15, listen to him, and the Lucan summary of Jesus' conversation with Moses and Elijah having to do with his Exodus and RSV departure. Okay, so like this is not some obscure idea. Most people would contend that the Mount of Transfiguration here is intended to be recalling this, the explicit use of the word Exodus and all of these images here. Okay, so we've seen here Hosea speaking about this prophecy of a second Exodus. We see Jesus here as described as this person who's going to accomplish an Exodus when he goes up to Jerusalem in the book of Luke. So now what I want to see a little bit more here is just go back and look at that Hosea 1, Hosea 1:10. I showed this before. It says, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered, yet, and it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people. There shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. So in Greek, huioi theou zontos. So this is a slightly harder question. I don't know if anybody knows this, but this expression, sons of the living God, is only used in the entire Bible 3 times besides this. Does anybody know where those 3 times happen to be? All right, so I'll show you. It's kind of, that was, like I said, it's a little bit of a tough question, but one of them is Paul just quotes Hosea again in Romans 9. So Paul himself quotes Hosea. It's kind of interesting. In Romans 9, he says, and in this very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. So I think that's very interesting that Paul, in a completely different letter, Hosea was a big enough element in his thought that he thinks to go back to Hosea to, in this case, describe the salvation of the Jewish people here, which we're not going to talk about Romans 9, but it's a theme about what's happening to the Jews who at the time were persecutors, and Paul believes are going to be restored and regrafted into the olive tree. But he calls on that. So he remembers Hosea there. So again, my thesis here is that Hosea is a really important book in the minds of the New Testament writers. Interestingly, the 2 other times are right out of Simon Peter's mouth. Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then in John 6, this is after Jesus gives a hard teaching about eating my flesh and drinking my blood. Simon Peter, same person, says, and we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So it's not a super common expression. Like I said, it's only used in Hosea and these instances here. It is an intriguing thought that Simon Peter, drawing on this phrase here, is recalling back this picture. Of course, it's used in the plural in Hosea, you are sons of the living God, but that Peter would think to put Jesus as the son, the chief of these people who are among this new Exodus here. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is talk about typology within Hosea. So I want to actually, before going on to that, in general, I think what we can say is this, that when people just read a verse like here and there, and they don't read it in the context of the whole book, you just miss so much. And it frustrates me to no end how much people don't use properly the context and the literary devices of a whole book when they read one of the individual sections. This past Wednesday, I gave a teaching here at the church I'm a part in on how to read the whole book effectively before you actually get into reading and dissecting out particular verses. But I think it's safe to say, just from this, that when you read it as a whole, you start to notice that Hosea is drawing a lot on this theme of Egypt and Exodus. All right, so this is a great quote from Dwayne Garrett, who's a very well-respected Bible commentator who says this. He says, "We need look no further than Hosea 11 to understand that Hosea too believed that God followed patterns in working with his people. Here, the slavery in Egypt is the pattern for a second period of enslavement in an alien land. And the exodus from Egypt is the type for a new exodus." We read that. Thus, the application of typological principles to Hosea 11:1 by Matthew is in keeping with the nature of prophecy itself and with Hosea's own method, right? Hosea is looking at the first Exodus under Moses, and he's saying there's going to be the second Exodus. And so Matthew, when he quotes from Hosea, he's following the very method that Hosea himself is using in his own language there. So really, really important concept here that I want us to know about. So this actually answers a couple of the questions that we raised. We said there were these three big problems that get emerged. One was that it seems like it's it seems like it's historic only, when in fact Matthew is taking it as prophetic. But in fact, in the context of the whole book, it's totally a prophetic reference to this future Exodus there. And then secondly, this corporate individual notion. This one, we don't have as much time to get into. I thought about including more slides on this, but I'll just say that in general, not just that sons of the living God, but in general, what's true of the king is true of the people. What's true of the people is true of the king. You find that in virtually the entirety of the Old Testament, this notion that you can have a corporate representation into an individual, and there's this reflective capacity back and forth where you can speak of them almost as synonymous. You can speak of the nation as being the king and the king as being with the nation. So in the interest of time, like I said, we're not going to go into that too much, because I want to make sure we hit one or two more ideas since we're already at 11:45. Okay, so this is a helpful concept here that I often think about. So I don't know, actually, before I show this, when you are going hiking, probably all of us have gone hiking here. So often, like you see like what you think is the top of the mountain. You're like, oh, we're almost there, and you get up there, and you're like, oh man, it's not there. It's further ahead, and you end up like getting fooled like 2 or 3 times that you think you're at the top when there's more in store that you just don't know about because you don't have a sufficiently high perspective. That's a lot of how I think about the prophets here. This diagram here is just a stylized prophet here who is looking forward, and in this case, seeing here the cross as well as the second coming, and often blending the two. And particularly when you read prophets like Isaiah, it's kind of mixed. Sometimes you'll see what seems to be suffering, sometimes there'll seem to be glory described, and it's hard to disentangle the two. But this notion here of a prophet seeing something here and not even necessarily being able to differentiate between the two. It's not obvious to me if you sat down with Isaiah, he would really know and understand and appreciate the texture and the separation of these mountains there when he's looking forward, and maybe doesn't fully understand, the church age. We don't exactly know here. In a very similar way, and this is, I hold this picture in my mind and I would offer it to you as well. Hosea basically is looking back at the Exodus, right? So we can kind of picture him almost as sitting in the middle maybe here, and he's looking back at this historic Exodus, and then he's looking forward as well to some second Exodus that's going to happen for the people. And what Matthew is basically doing is he's in keeping with this line, he's keeping in this axis here, which is not violating the author's intent. And in the same way that for us to pull apart, say, a prophetic vision of cross and crown, and to say, okay, well, now we know there was a first coming and a second coming, that's not violating the author's intent, even if that first author may have had a compacted vision of both of those events. This is sometimes called in the literature prophetic foreshortening. Prophetic foreshortening is basically where you see something as close that may actually be further behind. Again, think of the mountain. You think the mountain top is right in front of you, when in fact it's further back. This is very helpful, but it's not a violation of author intent, because really what we have is the ability to see in hindsight, with the benefit of the first coming, how these events lay out on a more careful topographical map, if you will. All right, so we're going to close here with a quick example. So this is the quick second example. As I said, the Hosea one is often treated as the most difficult one, which I think is for good reason. The second most difficult one that is used in the Bible is Isaiah 7. So Isaiah 7, we're going to go very, very quickly here, and I want to have a little bit of time for Q&A. Is a famous passage here where it says, "The Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, ask for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. The Lord will bring the king of Assyria upon you and your people and your father's house, days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah." All right, so I don't want to get too much in the history here, but just to keep it simple, Isaiah is having this discussion with Ahaz, and the sign that is given to Ahaz is the virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son, whose name will be Emmanuel. And it even says that before this child will know how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. And these are kings that were active at the time of Ahaz, and it had a fulfillment in Ahaz's life. And it's hard to deny that when you read this passage. So often people just read verse 14 and they don't read the context of this. But in fact, when you read it in context, Isaiah is talking about a particular child who will be born in Ahaz's life, who before he reaches this age of maturity, then there's going to be this devastation that happens to these kings. So people read that and they're like, oh no, this is the prophecy of the virgin birth, right? Like, again, it's Matthew here who makes this quote in Matthew chapter 1, where he cites Isaiah chapter 11:14, and they think, is this an example of the same phenomenon again? This is actually an easier case, because what you see inner to the text of Isaiah is that Isaiah himself knows that, again, picture that line, right? That line of a mountain here. There is an immediate fulfillment of this, which is some particular child here at the time. But in the very same context here, in Isaiah chapter 9, it talks about this child, and it says this famous line, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end." And so what we see here is that when you read, just like in Hosea, there's a lot more to it than you get just from an isolated verse. And you see this line, this trajectory, this type that even Isaiah seems to be aware of when he lapses into this, or I shouldn't say lapses, he goes up into this very lofty language of this child who will have these incredible titles here of Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, who clearly the first child couldn't bear that weight. And so in that way, again, Matthew, when he goes back and reflects on this, he's doing something very similar to what a good exegete should do in reading the whole book in its context. And you begin to see these lines, these directions emerge there. And thus these citations are entirely appropriate, and they're not at all violating authorial intent. Okay, so that's all I have here, and I'd love to just see if anybody has any questions or comments.
Hey, Finny. This is Manuel.
Yes.
So I have a question. that I realize it's a little bit specific. So I realize that it is also a little bit difficult to read. So a long time ago, I was reading about, a few years back, I was reading about the Jehovah's Witness and their sort of prophecies and their use of scripture and scripture also to justify a lot of their sort of end of time prophecies and also their structure. I don't recall specific examples now, so that's why I said it would be a little bit difficult to answer the question. But sometimes they seem to be using. But I did make at the time a little bit of a troubling inference, and I said, they are making this sort of application of the prophecies, which we think are incorrect, and I do think they are incorrect. However, by picking up, maybe scriptures out of context from the Old Testament and so on. But then I said, it feels sometimes that the New Testament writers are doing the same. And of course, as I said, it's a little bit difficult for not bringing specific examples to answer the question, but how would you distinguish? Because in a way, it's relatively easy to do that with almost any book, the Bible, but almost any book, to take some passages and say it means this or it means that. So how do you avoid in a way the mistake, and how do we know that the New Testament writers didn't do the same mistake?
Yeah. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are a very interesting case study. By the way, it's good to hear from you and all. Their founder, Charles Russell, was famous for making a prophecy about the end of the world. So he prophesied that the world would end in the 1920s, and the world obviously did not end. And so at that point, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they revised their prophecy to say, oh no, it was actually a secret second coming that happened. People had sold their possessions. I mean, they had really buckled down and prepared that it was going to be the end. And if that wasn't enough, they didn't learn their lesson. In the 1970s, they made a second prediction that they said that the world was going to end. And a lot of people that I even know myself, they sold their possessions, they prepared for the end, they went on this big evangelistic campaign. And of course, the world didn't end again. And actually, a lot of people ended up believing the Jehovah's Witnesses at that point, although some people managed to convince themselves somehow that was okay. The Watchtower has since apologized for that. The Watchtower is their official organization, and they apologized for the mistake, particularly that they made in the 1970s. One of the things that you see when you read Charles Russell, and frankly, it's embarrassing when you go back and read some of the early documents. And I always encourage my friends who are Jehovah's Witnesses to actually go back and read Russell and some of the statements that he made there. And it is so bad and so embarrassing how poorly he even knew the Bible, much less could exegete the Bible in any kind of responsible way. There was a lot of times when he would quote from passages, and he would be unable to reproduce even just simple contextual understandings of what happened. To give a little further story of this, he said in one account, somebody said, he said, I know Greek. I happen to know Greek. And somebody says, oh, could you tell us the Greek alphabet? He couldn't recite the Greek alphabet, and he's saying that he knew Greek. And you just have this pattern of deception and falsehood that marks the Jehovah's Witnesses. I personally would say it marks the story of Joseph Smith and the Mormons as well, with huge fabrications. The story of Oliver Cowdery and the translations, the quote translation that happened with the Urim and Thummim there. So I would say, in general, what you see marked with these individuals is no knowledge, neither Joseph Smith nor Charles Russell, of original languages, responsible exegesis. Instead, these terribly pathetic attempts to pull these verses out to justify their purposes. Accusations of a lot of falsehoods that I would say are demonstrably historical. And in general, when you look at good exegesis, it's marked by looking at the whole, being sensitive to larger themes, larger patterns, going carefully into original languages. You just don't see anything near that in Jehovah's Witnesses. There was a Jehovah's Witnesses that came to my door maybe a year or two ago, and I started sharing these things and asking with him, and they forbid you, if you're a Jehovah's Witnesses, to read other books that are from other organizations that would challenge that. And you think, come on, you can't even read books on the other side. So these kinds of movements and efforts have all the hallmarks of deception and being wrong at their core. I don't even put them in the same league of what we see in the Old Testament and New Testament. Tuong had a question, I believe.
Yeah. Hey. Thanks so much for the talk. It just seems like I think I actually haven't like thought about this. So it's like really great education for me. Do you think there's a case to be made that Matthew could have picked a less controversial like quote from Hosea and still accomplish his mission and get his point across?
Yeah, I mean, he could have. I mean, I'm sure he could have not included it, but I think in general, when people are pulling a verse, I think that the mistake that we make is we try to take that verse apart from its context. Whereas I think in general, what New Testament authors are doing when they're citing a verse, they want you to think not just of the verse, but of the larger context and the whole author. And that's a really important differentiation, particularly with how Paul uses the Old Testament in the book of Romans. So in Romans 9-11, it's one of my pet peeves. People will say, okay, well, Paul says, Jacob I've loved, Esau I've hated. And they take that as a statement about how God is going to unconditionally elect people for eternal damnation or eternal salvation. But then you look up that particular verse, it's a quote from Malachi. And it's about Jacob and Edom, the nation of Jacob and the nation of Edom, hundreds of years after Jacob and Esau even lived. And so when you read it in context, you should be thinking about, Malachi, he's talking about the fact that he's denouncing the nation of Edom for joining in violence against the Israelites, the people of Judah, when they were ransacked by Babylon. Okay, so when you just do that, you start to realize, whoa, I'm reading this in a whole new light there, because it's really about this question of the people group there as opposed to the individual, right? So in general, I could go on and on about Romans 9-11, but in general, we have to grab the larger context there. And so I think Hosea 11 is almost the perfect place to pull from, because you get the reference there to the Son, which, Jesus is the Son. And then, of course, you get the second Exodus described down in verses 10-11. And so it's hard for me to imagine a better place to pick once you've read the whole book there. I mean, you could have done less controversial, but I think he's going for here what is most accurately capturing the messianic theme. So yeah,
gotcha.
Good,
okay.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
We'll do one last question, and then we'll break for the year here. Anybody have a final question?
Yeah, my question was kind of similar to Tuong's, Finny, about for us when we're reading these passages now. I know there's probably lots of references the New Testament authors make in the Old Testament, and then there's probably some that they don't make, and so there seems that there's a lot of spaces we're reading things now too to discover and see typologies we didn't. Should we think of what the New Testament authors are doing as guardrails to check whether I don't know, you read through passages in Isaiah and you're like, wow, this sounds like he's talking about the Lord, but you don't see any New Testament references necessarily to it. Should we think of them as guardrails to keep you in check that you're reading those accurately?
It's a great question, Kojo. And I think in general, one of the things that we should feel free to do, I believe, is to use the same principles that the New Testament uses hermeneutically as we read the Old Testament. So I'll give you an example of that. There's a famous story all of us know, most of us would know this, of Abraham offering up Isaac on the mountain, right? And most of us take this as an example, as a type of the Father offering up the Son on Calvary, right? Thousands of years later. And I totally buy that. I totally believe that's correct, but it's never once mentioned in the New Testament, right? So we all use that and kind of assume that's a type of the Father after the Son, but okay, show me one apostle who says that. Nobody actually uses that. But I still think it's legitimate, because you have this very consistent typology that's used. In Hebrews 11, it seems like Abraham thinks that Isaac is going to be resurrected there, so you could make maybe some small connection there. And And yet, when you look at the whole list of what's going on there, because you have Isaac who's carrying this wood up the mountain, Jesus is carrying the wood, the cross up the mountain. I mean, there's so many things that start to layer on. And one of the things that can help us to not be undisciplined in this is to look and see, because it is possible to be fanciful and to go to some extreme, but to say, okay, look, does this pass the test of kind of historic consensus? And does thanks, Jeff. Jeff put up on the chat there, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Does it meet this broader historical sense that it seems reasonable? We're not just kind of out on left field by ourselves here. And does it use some of these same principles of this inner biblical exegesis, this typology that we see used by multiple authors? And if so, I think we should use it, and use it with joy, because we are challenged, and we are supposed to find Jesus in the scriptures, right? I mean, he says he's in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Jesus is supposed to be the theme all around. And John himself says, I didn't have time. I didn't have space to write down all the things that I wanted to put in here, right? He says all the books in the world could have been filled, and I would have run out. And so that's left us, is to go and make those discoveries and fill it up. So yeah, we can and should be doing those things with a lot of humility, but responsibility, but also joy, knowing that this is something that we're called to do. So, all right, everyone. Well, hey, great to see you all. And I will really look forward to seeing everybody, hopefully, in the new year. God bless. And may hopefully coronavirus will be behind us soon.
Thanks a lot. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Finny. This has
Thanks
been
a lot,
really rich.
Finny.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Brenda.